There are no atheists in foxholes. There are none in critical care hospital rooms either. Now, I'm sure if you wanted to fact check that statement, you more than likely could prove it literally wrong. I'm sure that in the vast history of human conflict, you could find at least one instance where a non-believer was in an active combat role or in a hospital room. So sometimes a statement can be literally false, but the sentiment behind it can be very true. Take this picture of the iceberg, the top part. Think of that as the statement that really isn't correct, and then underneath it you have this fuller picture. And that's sort of how I take that statement. The statement there are no atheists in foxholes, and perhaps it's just bad wording. I mean, you could fix the whole problem just by changing it to there are very few atheists in foxholes, or very few atheists in critical care hospital rooms. I think that would be less offensive, although I'm sure on the internet you could find people that would want to debate the precise definition of very few. But the point is, it's really not about an argument between theism or atheism. It's that people tend to be more religious, or they tend to try to find a closer relationship to God when they're in really tough times. The idea of a foxhole or a critical care bed is just analogous to a very tough time, a very difficult situation. So men have a tendency to draw near to God when times are tough, and of course in good times, the reverse is often true. When you're actually in the promised land and it's flowing with the milk and honey, and you're blessed and there's not much adversity in your life, that's when men's hearts start to go astray. They start to think, well, I've done all this for myself. Times are good. They don't see the point in staying close to God, because at this point, what do they need him for? They're kind of like that kid with rich grandparents that only goes to see their grandparents when they need money, and otherwise ignores them until the next time they're low on cash. Don't treat God that way. But anyway, that's sort of the pattern we're going to explore in the rest of this video. Men calling on God and trying to get closer to God when times are tough, and then on the flip side, forgetting when times are good. So how does the Bible begin? Well, after the creation, it starts with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And people debate precisely the meaning of all these stories, but I think it's relatively uncontroversial to say that the Garden of Eden was a very good place for man to be. I mean, it was full of fruit-bearing trees that men could obtain with little effort. Think of a walled garden that's easy to maintain, and you're protected, and life is very easy for you. Not much adversity to contend with. And they have just one simple rule to follow. Well, I suppose a few. They're supposed to keep the garden, and then they're supposed to not eat from this one tree that God tells them not to eat from. Everything else they can eat from, not that tree. So notice, like, they're in like the best place they could possibly be. In the garden of God, in the presence of God, blessed beyond measure. And that's when they screw up. Times where maybe they were too good for them. That's where they get careless and disobey the word of God, and that's what gets them kicked out of the garden. And then what happens to them? Well, life gets a lot harder. Instead of a well-kept, low-maintenance garden, now Adam has to till the ground by the sweat of his own brow if he wants to eat. And not only does the earth produce sustenance for him, but it also produces thorns and weeds, and he has to contend with all those. But you know what? I bet when he was sweating his nuts off trying to make enough food so he doesn't starve to death, I bet he did a lot more praying. I bet he had a lot more conversations with his wife along the lines of, "Hey, honey, let's not listen to any more serpents going forward." And this is a pattern that is repeated over and over and over again in the Bible, maybe in different ways, but it's very much the same pattern. When I was in my late teens, maybe early 20s, I went on sort of a intellectual journey and studied religion and tried to get all different perspectives. And And I try to gather up as many perspectives as possible, and then sift through them and try to get the fullest picture that I could. And honestly, like, if you're really interested in a topic and you want to have the best understanding that's humanly possible, that would be my advice to you is research it like that. Just get as many perspectives as possible and try to get the fullest picture that you can. And at some point in this journey, I remember somebody telling me that the New Testament was anti-Semitic, that it put the Jewish people in a very bad light. And I remember thinking, really, have you read the Old Testament? Because it's essentially the story of Abraham and his descendants. And there's definitely some high points, but there's also plenty of stories that are not very flattering. For example, God finds favor with Abraham. There was just something about the way Abraham was, or the way he lived, that evidently God liked, because he makes this covenant with Abraham and promises to make a great nation of him and bless his seed after him. So definitely a high point for the descendants of Abraham. But what happens a few generations later? Well, Abraham has a son Isaac. Isaac has a son Jacob. Later, God changes Jacob's name to Israel. And Jacob/Israel goes on to have 12 sons. Those 12 sons become the 12 tribes of Israel. Rather, their descendants after them become the 12 tribes of Israel. But what do Jacob's 12 sons, 11 of them do? They become envious of their youngest brother, Joseph, because he's the youngest and he's favored of his father. He also seems to be favored by God a little bit, because he dreams these dreams, and he's also maybe somewhat of a prophet or an interpreter of dreams. Certainly God has bestowed upon Joseph some sort of wisdom. And probably for a combination of these reasons, his brothers get very jealous of him, and they decide to beat him up and throw him down a well, leave him for dead. So clearly at that moment, they had drifted away from God. Their hearts weren't close to God, or they wouldn't be beating up their brother and throwing him down a well. And keep in mind, these 12 sons of Jacob, these were basically the great-grandsons of Abraham. So what happens next? Well, the brothers feel kind of bad because, it really isn't right that they should leave their brother for dead, so they fetch him out of the well, and instead they sell him to some slave traders. Okay, that's a little bit better. At least they're not completely like Cain. I mean, they didn't murder their brother in this case. They just sold him off to be a slave, and his brother ends up in Egypt eventually. He ends up in prison at one point. Because God is with Joseph, and because he has this ability to interpret dreams, it actually saves him. Pharaoh has this recurring dream that troubles him, and becomes known that Joseph is an interpreter of dreams, and he starts interpreting dreams for Pharaoh. Pharaoh counts him as a wise man, takes him out of prison, makes him basically the right-hand man, gives him great power in the land of Egypt. And ultimately, this story explains how the Israelites ended up in Egypt to begin with. There's a famine in Canaan. Jacob and his sons need food. Egypt has plenty of food, and this is largely because of Joseph, so that they end up going to Egypt. Thankfully for them, Joseph is in the position that he's in, so he can help them out a lot. But for the next generations, something happens. The Egyptians start to see these Israelites as more and more of a threat, because they're getting too numerous, and so they start to oppress them. Before you know it, the Israelites are slaves in the land of Egypt. They're essentially like second-class citizens, or probably even a little worse. And one might ask, well, why did God allow this to happen to the Israelites? Maybe it was a bit of karma. I mean, look what the sons of Israel did to their youngest brother. They beat him up and sold him into slavery. Perhaps this was their punishment. Look, you guys made your brother a slave. Now you're going to be slaves for a few generations. In any event, the Israelites fall on hard times in Egypt. And undoubtedly, this is when they start to cry out to God because of their affliction and their oppression that they're suffering in Egypt. So perhaps it took this affliction to really bring them closer to God, or at least to a place where they're crying out to the God of their fathers. And of course, you have the Exodus story. God sends Moses to free the Israelites and lead them out of Egypt and towards the promised land. And of course, he does this in such a way that like it should be unmistakable that God's hand was doing this. With all the plagues that God through Moses inflicted on the Egyptians, it should have been obvious that clearly there's something supernatural going on here. That God was going to make it abundantly clear that it was Him leading, freeing the Israelites and getting them out of Egypt. But then what happens? As soon as they're out of Egypt, they start rebelling against Moses and God. Moses goes up to get the commandments, and while he's gone, before you know it, the Israelites are built this golden calf to worship instead of the God of their fathers. So while they're in Egypt and times are hard, that's when they really cry out to God. And then as soon as they're free, or at least out of Egypt, they begin to backslide and forget about God already. Fast forward, they wander through the desert for 40 years, and when they eventually do make it into the promised land, well, that's when it's really, really easy for them to forget about God. When Joshua leads them across the river and they drive out all their enemies and begin to possess the land, when they're basically in the promised land flowing with milk and honey and God's blessing them, that's when it's really, really easy to forget about the God of their fathers. Because, hey, times are good. What do we need all these stuffy rules for? We're rich now. We can do our own thing. So the whole Old Testament is this cycle over and over again. So the Israelites they're in the land for a while. Times are good. They get corrupted. They start following false gods. Iniquity begins to overtake and take the land as people drift away from God. So God's not just going to allow this to continue. So He sends them prophets, warning them that you guys better shape up, or else I'm gonna drive you out of this land that I promised to give to your fathers and their descendants. And sometimes the people listen, sometimes they don't. But ultimately, it gets bad enough that God brings the Babylonians to invade the kingdom of Israel, and He carries off the remnant of them, and they're captives and slaves in Babylon for a while. What happens when they're in captivity for 70 years? It gives them some time to reflect on the errors of their ways, and what happens? They start to call on God again. Ultimately, God restores them and brings them back to their promised land. So you see this pattern over and over and over again in the stories of the Bible. And this is speaking in the national level, but even down to the individual level. Think of the story of King David. Now, King David is a righteous king. He's a man after God's own heart, the Bible says. And David was probably the closest to God when he was being persecuted by Saul, and he was basically exiled. Saul was the king before him. Saul became very jealous of David and tried to kill him on multiple occasions. And while David's suffering all this persecution, he's very, very close to God. But eventually, Saul dies. David becomes the undisputed king, and God is with David, so he wins the battles against his enemies, and times are good for him. And that's when his heart starts to drift away. And even good kings like King David have their dark side. I won't go into all the details, but it involved adultery and then treachery to try to cover up the fact. And this, of course, brings God's judgment upon David, and things get very rough for him for a while until he repents and seeks God again and is restored. And there's a similar pattern with the next king in Israel, King Solomon. Solomon becomes king at a very young age, and he's put in a pretty difficult situation. Here he is, this barely a teenager, and he's got to rule over this whole kingdom. So what is he? He's humble at this point. He prays to God and asks for wisdom and understanding, and God gives him that, and a whole lot of other things. And he's blessed, and his kingdom is thriving. Unlike David, who is more of a warlord, Solomon reigns in a time of peace. And because it was a time of peace and society wasn't invested in making war, they had a lot more time and energy to invest in agriculture and trade, and it became a very prosperous time. And times became very good, and that's when Solomon gets into trouble. See, Solomon took a lot of wives, and some of the wives that he took were from neighboring nations. And this was sort of a practice in the ancient world. One way that one kingdom would try to ensure peace with another is they would intermarry. You know, if you're a king and you're worried about the kingdom next door potentially seeing you as an enemy and going to war with you, well, one way you would prevent that is by marrying one of his daughters, and then you have familial ties with this other king. But in any event, Solomon took all these wives. Some of them were from other lands that worshipped other gods, and he let these wives bring some of their false gods into the kingdom of Israel, and God didn't like that. So that's sort of Solomon's mistake. You know, I could go into all sorts of other examples. It's a reoccurring theme throughout the Bible. You might be tempted to think, wow, in the Old Testament, those Jews, they were really a stubborn, stiff-necked people. I mean, how many times do they have to live out this pattern before they realize, oh, I guess we always need to stay close to God? But before you judge them too harshly, are they really that much different than the rest of us? I mean, doesn't that describe all of us that try to walk with God? Speaking from my own experiences, it was probably traumas and difficulties in my youth that spurred me to go on my religious journey in the first place. Maybe it's because I didn't have a lot else going for me at the time that I thought, hey, let's actually sit down and read this Bible, and let's listen to different preachers and go to Bible studies and wrestle with the meaning of different scriptures. And I began to write about and debate different interpretations with people. And then at some point, I found out that I'm very slow at typing, and I tend to misspell words and forget punctuation and all that stuff. So ultimately, I turned to making videos about my thoughts on religion, because it's just a better medium for me. But anyway, times became pretty good, in both in my religious walk and otherwise in life. And I suppose I didn't really fall into adverse times again until my 30s, when my first marriage fell apart. And if I was to really be honest with myself, the root cause of my marriage falling apart was probably that I had drifted away from God and His principles and precepts. Because if I hadn't, my marriage probably wouldn't have fallen apart, would it have? Anyway, eventually I realized my mistake and turned back to God, and wouldn't you know it, times are good again. Hopefully, it'll be a long time before I forget that lesson and screw things up again. And if any of this is resonating with you, the viewer, well, perhaps you should find some way to remind yourself so that you don't forget. Or perhaps just read the Bible on a regular basis, because it teaches this lesson over and over and over again in different ways. And, you know, the New Testament isn't really that much different in that regard. It's the same thing. You know, if you call yourself a Christian, are you really following the teachings of Christ? Because if you start drifting away from those teachings, that's when you're going to get into trouble. Anyway, those are my thoughts. What are yours? Let me know in the comment section below. You've been watching the Flutch Report. If you're hearing this, it means you've made it to the end of the video. But before you click onto the next thing and continue down whatever rabbit hole you're on YouTube or Rumble, I've got a small favor to ask. If you found value in my content and you want to help the channel out, the best thing you can do is share it with somebody else that you think will find value in it. Don't forget to hit the like button. Subscribe if you want to see more. Links to the channel on YouTube and Rumble will be provided below. Additionally, I'm making a Facebook page for the channel, as well as a X/formerly Twitter. Feel free to follow me on those platforms as well. If you're feeling exceptionally generous, provided in the description below will be a link to Buy Me a Coffee, which is the online equivalent of a tip jar. Thanks for watching, and thanks for supporting the channel.